He was a farmer's son who rose to become a god in the eyes of a billion people. Mao Zedong promised to awaken a sleeping giant, to restore China's pride and build a communist utopia. He promised a new China, unified, independent, and strong, where everyone would have a shot at a better life. And in many ways, he delivered. He took a country torn apart by war and humiliation and forged it into a world power. But the utopia he promised became a real-world hell for millions. His relentless pursuit of ideological purity, backed by absolute power, would unleash the single greatest man-made famine in human history. It would plunge an entire nation into a decade of terror, pitting neighbor against neighbor and children against their own parents. This is the story of how one man's vision, a vision that began with noble promises, led to the deaths of tens of millions and left a legacy of horror that haunts China to this day. This is the horrifying reign of Mao Zedong. To understand the man who would become the great helmsman, you have to go back to where his story began, the small village of Shaoshan, in Hunan province. Born on December 26, 1893, Mao Zedong was the son of a peasant, though a fairly well-off one by local standards. His father was a strict, no-nonsense grain dealer who expected his son to learn the family business. But Mao was a rebellious kid, hungry for a world of knowledge that stretched far beyond his village. At just 14, he defied his father by rejecting an arranged marriage, an early flicker of the defiance that would define his life. By 16, he'd left the farm for good, enrolling in a school in the provincial capital, Chiang. It was here that young Mao got swept up in the chaos of early 20th century China. The ancient Qing dynasty was collapsing, and revolutionary ideas were everywhere. He watched the Xinhai Revolution of 1911 topple the monarchy and even briefly joined the Revolutionary Army. These were his formative years, a time of intellectual awakening spent devouring books on philosophy, history, and politics. He worked odd jobs, but his real calling was revolution. Bouncing between cities, he jumped into fiery debates, wrote articles, and searched for an ideology that could explain China's weakness and offer a path to salvation. He found his answer in the radical ideas of Karl Marx. By 1920, Mao had fully embraced Marxism, and the next year, he became one of the 12 founding members of the Chinese Communist Party. While other founders looked to the factory workers in the cities as the heart of the revolution, Mao had a different, uniquely Chinese idea. He looked to the countryside. He saw China's future not in the cities, but in the immense, untapped power of its peasant masses. This insight would become the core of his ideology and the key to his ultimate victory. Mao's rise in the Communist Party wasn't immediate, it was a slow, calculated climb, forged in the fires of civil war and strategic brilliance. In the 1920s and 30s, the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, was the junior partner to the much larger nationalist party, the Kuomintang, led by Chiang Kai-shek. But their alliance was shaky, and it soon shattered. Chiang turned on the communists, starting a brutal purge that forced the CCP underground into a desperate fight for survival. This is where Mao's theories were put to the test. While others stuck to Soviet doctrine focused on city uprisings, Mao took to the mountains. In the remote countryside of Jiangxi province, he and his followers carved out a defensible base, a Soviet in the heart of China. Here, he perfected his revolutionary strategy, mobilizing the peasantry and mastering the art of guerrilla warfare. He knew that in a huge, agrarian country like China, a conventional army could be swallowed whole. But an army of peasants, fighting on their own turf, moving like fish in the sea, they could be invincible. Mao's leadership was cemented during the party's darkest hour, the Long March. In 1934, surrounded by Chiang Kai-shek's armies, the Red Army had to abandon its base and begin an epic, year-long retreat. It was a grueling trek of some 6,000 miles, across treacherous mountains and raging rivers, all while under constant attack. Of the roughly 86,000 who began the First Red Army's Long March, the main force Mao accompanied, only about 7,000 to 8,000 are believed to have survived, a loss of over 90%. But the Long March wasn't just a retreat, it became a defining myth. It was a testament to the party's grit and, above all, to Mao's iron will. During the ordeal, through brilliant political maneuvering, he he consolidated his control over the CCP, emerging as its undisputed leader. This process culminated at the party's 7th Congress in 1945, when he was formally elected chairman of the Central Committee, a position that made him the undisputed leader of the CCP for the remaining 3 decades of his life. The following years saw the Japanese invasion of China, which forced a tense truce between the communists and nationalists. But when World War II ended, the Civil War exploded again. Mao directed the strategy, using his guerrilla tactics and the widespread support of peasants drawn to his promises of land reform. Chiang Kai-shek's government, riddled with corruption and out of touch with the rural masses, simply crumbled. On October 1, 1949, standing atop the Gate of Heavenly Peace in Beijing, Mao Zedong proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China. The crowd roared. Decades of revolution and bloodshed had led to this moment. The peasant son from Shaoshan was now the absolute ruler of the world's most populous nation. The war was won. The country was his. But what kind of country would it be? In the first years of his rule, Chairman Mao was wildly popular, and for good reason. For millions of ordinary Chinese, the communist victory felt like a true liberation. While the old government catered to the rich, Mao's new regime rolled out policies that seemed to genuinely help the common person. His first major act was a massive land reform program. The old system of powerful landlords was dismantled, and their land was seized and given to hundreds of millions of poor farmers. For people who had known nothing but servitude, owning the soil they worked was a revolutionary change. This wasn't a peaceful process. To break the power of the old rural elite, the party organized speak bitterness sessions, where peasants were encouraged to publicly denounce their former landlords. These sessions often exploded into mass violence. Former landlords were persecuted, publicly humiliated, and frequently executed, their deaths serving as a brutal lesson in the new social order. Though horrifically violent, the campaign shattered the old class structure and cemented the party's control over the countryside. With the countryside secured, Mao focused on modernizing China. After the Korean War ended in 1953, he launched the first 5-year plan. Modeled on the Soviet system, it created a centrally controlled economy focused on rapid industrialization. New factories shot up, laying the groundwork for China's industrial base. Alongside these economic goals came huge social changes. The party expanded basic medical services and rural education. The 1950 marriage law, in particular, fundamentally changed the status of women. It banned arranged marriages, child marriage, and the practice of keeping concubines, while also giving women the right to initiate divorce for the first time. Brutal traditions like foot binding were officially ended. For many women, these reforms were a huge leap towards equality, earning Mao and the party their passionate loyalty. In those early years, it looked like the promise of a new China was being fulfilled. The nation was unified and, for the first time in a century, free from foreign control. Literacy and life expectancy were rising, and a sense of national pride was in the air. Mao had delivered stability and real benefits to a huge part of the population. He was hailed as the nation's savior. But this period of progress was just the prelude to something far more radical and terrifying. Mao didn't just want to change China, he wanted to remake human nature itself. And he was willing to sacrifice anyone to achieve that vision. By 1958, Mao was getting impatient. The steady, Soviet-style progress was too slow for his revolutionary spirit. He believed China could leapfrog decades of development through sheer force of will. He made an audacious claim: in just a few years, China would surpass the industrial might of Great Britain. To do it, he unleashed his most ambitious and catastrophic campaign, the Great Leap Forward. The goal was to transform China from a farm-based society into a communist paradise, virtually overnight. Private property was abolished. The small family farms that had existed for centuries were gone. Instead, the entire rural population, some 500 million people, was herded into massive, state-run, people's communes. Life became totally collectivized. Families ate in communal dining halls, and some radical communes even had gender-segregated dormitories. Mao's plan for industrialization was just as unhinged from reality. He ignored experts, believing revolutionary passion could conquer any material obstacle. The most infamous example was the backyard furnace campaign. Millions of peasants were ordered to build crude furnaces to boost steel production. They melted down everything they could find: pots, pans, farm tools, even doorknobs. The result wasn't steel but millions of tons of useless, brittle pig iron. Worse, it pulled labor away from the fields, leaving crops to rot. The agricultural plan was even more disastrous. Mao was captivated by the pseudoscience of Soviet agronomist Trofim Lysenko, who claimed that planting seeds incredibly close together would create bigger yields. It didn't. It choked the seedlings and led to crop failure. The party also launched the For Pests campaign, ordering the extermination of rats, flies, mosquitoes, and sparrows, because Mao claimed sparrows ate too much grain. The ecological fallout was catastrophic. With their main predator gone, insect populations exploded, devouring what little grain was left. But at the heart of the tragedy were the grain quotas. Local officials, terrified of failing to meet Mao's impossible targets, started faking their reports, claiming record harvests while their people began to starve. The central government, believing the lies, took its share of grain based on these inflated numbers, leaving the peasants with almost nothing. The result was the Great Chinese Famine, the deadliest famine in human history. From 1959 to 1961, starvation swept the countryside. Desperate people ate tree bark, leather, and even mud. Reports of cannibalism became horrifyingly common. Yet, while his people starved, Mao refused to admit failure. Warehouses full of grain were kept sealed for export or left to rot. When a top official, Peng Dehuai, dared to criticize the Great Leap, Mao publicly purged him and doubled down on the campaign. The message was clear: loyalty to Mao was more important than reality, more important than life. The final death toll remained staggering. Credible historical estimates range from at least 15 million to as high as 55 million deaths, making it the deadliest famine in recorded human history. It was a man-made catastrophe of biblical proportions. The colossal failure of the Great Leap Forward was a blow to Mao's power. He stepped back from day-to-day governing as more pragmatic leaders, like Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, worked to clean up the economic mess. But Mao didn't see this as a necessary course correction, he saw it as a betrayal. He became obsessed with the idea that capitalist ideas were creeping back into China and that bourgeois elements inside the party were plotting against him. He believed the revolution was in danger. But this was also Mao's brutal, brilliant play to reclaim absolute power and crush all his rivals. In May 1966, he launched his final, defining revolution, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. He knew he couldn't trust the party establishment, so he bypassed it completely and appealed directly to China's youth. He told students to bombard the headquarters and famously declared, "To rebel is justified." Millions of fervent teenagers answered his call, forming paramilitary squads known as the Red Guards. Mao had unleashed a hurricane, and he was its undisputed center. What followed was a decade of chaos and terror. The Red Guards, armed with Mao's little red book of quotes, went on a nationwide rampage. Schools were shut down as students turned on their teachers, beating and torturing them. Children were encouraged to inform on their parents for any sign of disloyalty. Neighbor turned against neighbor. No one was safe. Mao's stated goal was to purge China of the old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. In reality, it was a war on Chinese civilization itself. Priceless art, ancient books, and historic temples were destroyed. Intellectuals, writers, and artists were branded enemies of the state. They were publicly shamed, sent to labor camps, or beaten to death in the streets. The cult of personality around Mao reached its peak. He wasn't just a leader, he was a god. His portrait was everywhere. His words were scripture. Every day, hundreds of millions of Chinese would start their day by wishing Chairman Mao a long life and reciting his quotations. Loyalty was the only virtue. The chaos spun out of control as different Red Guard factions began fighting each other, each claiming to be the true defenders of Mao's thought. The country slid into near anarchy. It got so violent that Mao eventually had to call in the army to restore order, sending millions of the same Red Guards he had unleashed to the countryside to learn from the peasants. The Cultural Revolution lasted for a decade, until Mao's death in 1976. The exact death toll is still debated, but scholarly estimates of violent deaths and suicides range from 500,000 to over 2 million, with tens of millions more persecuted or sent to labor camps. The social and psychological scars were immeasurable. It destroyed a generation's education, shattered countless families, and laid waste to much of China's cultural heritage. It was Mao's final act, a revolution that consumed its own children and cemented his power through pure terror. On September 9, 1976, Mao Zedong died at the age of 82. The god had become mortal. His death was met with a wave of orchestrated national grief, but behind the public mourning lay a nation exhausted and traumatized by his rule. To this day, Mao's legacy is deeply and bitterly controversial. In the West, he is widely regarded as one of the three deadliest dictators of the 20th century, alongside Hitler and Stalin. Yet, in China, his legacy is far more complex and carefully managed. His portrait still hangs over Tiananmen Square, and his face is on every banknote. The Communist Party officially judges him to be the 70% right and 30% wrong. He is revered as the founding father who unified China, ended a century of humiliation, and made the nation a world power. Both of these portraits hold some truth. Mao's early reforms did improve literacy and public health, and he did transform China's global standing. But his great leap forward caused the worst famine in history. And his Cultural Revolution plunged his own people into a decade of madness. He was the peasant who became an emperor, the poet who wrote in rivers of blood, the liberator who built a nation-sized prison. His story is a horrifying testament to how a utopian dream, when fused with absolute power and a total disregard for human life, can create a living nightmare. To understand China today, you must first understand the man who shaped it, for Mao's shadow, long and dark, still stretches over the nation he both built and brutalized. If you found this exploration of history compelling, subscribe to our channel for more documentaries that uncover the past. And let us know in the comments which historical event or figure you want to see us explore next. Thank you for watching.